Hey there, what's up, my friends? It's your buddy Phil here, project management trainer and coach. Windy night here in British Columbia. I wanted to talk to you today about risk management because we had a class earlier and I realized in the middle of the class that people actually struggle with the understanding of what risk is. So I wanted to talk to you really quickly about risk management in a more organic perspective. So when you think about a risk, what is a risk? Risk is uncertainty that can impact your project. It's really uncertainty that matters, as my buddy the risk doctor said. It's uncertainty that matters. Now, we have an uncertain event over there that it could rain. Look at those clouds. Now, that's an uncertain event, but does it impact your project? No. I'm all the way over here, the other side of the world for many of you. You don't care if it's going to rain. It's uncertain that it's going to rain, but you don't care, right? Because it's not impacting your project. So when we talk about project risk management, we're talking about risks that matter, uncertainty that matters. So let's establish that. It's all about uncertainty. All right. So if risk is an uncertain event that could impact your project or impact a situation for you, think about it. If that uncertain event that you're thinking about has materialized, can we really call it a risk? Think about it. You cannot call it a risk if it's happened. Think about this. An event that you didn't foresee, perhaps you're driving and it was all bright and sunny, and then all of a sudden that happened. You didn't foresee that that would happen. What do you call that? That's not a risk. That is an unknown that has now materialized. It's an unknown event. So when you think about risk management, it's important that you do not see unknowns as risks. So once upon a time, the term unknown risks was used. But folks who understand risk management these days, they don't use unknown risks. There's no such thing as an unknown risk. A risk is an uncertain event that you know of. An unknown is something you do not know. Now, talking about risk management can be used for things that you know, and also you can establish a contingency called a management reserve. Well, it's not a contingency, it's a reserve called a management reserve. You can establish a management reserve for those unknowns, but we should not call them unknown risks. See, contingency reserves are for known risks. Management reserves are for unknown risks. So my point is, when you're talking about risk management, do not think of unknowns, because unknowns are not risks. Hence, the term unknown risks is not correct. All right? Now, beyond that, let me ask you a few basic risk management questions. You're a project manager on a project, and an unknown event occurs, something that you hadn't thought of previously. What should you do? Should you mitigate? Should you transfer? Should you avoid? Or should you accept? What would you do? That's the question. What would you do? Now, when you think about this, it doesn't make sense to use any of those risk approaches because this is not a risk. Get it? An unknown is not a risk. And that is the point I'm trying to make. An unknown is not a risk. So you cannot use risk management approaches to deal with an unknown. And the same token, if I said a risk has occurred, a risk that you had identified has occurred, you apply a contingency reserve to deal with the risk. What strategy is that? Think about that. Is that avoid? Is that mitigate? Is that transfer? Or is that accept? Which one is it? So when you think about these risk approaches, it's important that you don't mix them up. Because if you apply a contingency reserve to a risk, you've accepted that risk already. Well, when the risk occurs, your contingency plan, your fallback plan, those are things you can apply to a risk that has occurred. You see what I'm saying? But you cannot say that you're mitigating a risk that has already happened. You get my point? Saying you're mitigating a risk that has already happened is not correct, because it's already happened. Mitigate is reducing the probability or impact of occurrence before it happens. Once it's happened, it's too late. See what I'm saying here? Let's examine another perspective. You're a project manager on a project. You apply a contingency reserve to a risk. The contingency reserve fails. Okay, we've already established that's accept. You apply a fallback plan. You get more resources. And that's your fallback plan. What do you call that? Do you call that mitigate? Do you call that avoid? Do you call that transfer? What do you call it? The answer is still accept. You see, in the world of the PMI, the contingency plan and the fallback plan, they're used interchangeably. They're the same thing. So you cannot say you're mitigating. You cannot say you are transferring. You cannot say you are avoiding or escalating once the risk has happened. You see, if you wanted to do escalate, avoid, transfer, mitigate, you should have done that before the risk happened. You see, once the risk has happened, anything you're doing after the fact is a fallback plan or is a contingency plan or contingency reserve. And you do know these terms are used interchangeably, don't you? See what I'm saying? So there's a little bit of a misconception when people talk about risks. They tend to muddy the waters with what happens after occurrence of a risk or after occurrence of an unknown. An unknown is not a risk. Anything you do after the fact is none of those four I mentioned. Okay? So just bear in mind that on the exam, if you are ever asked a question about an unknown event or about a risk that has occurred, your answer should not be any of those four. Now, talking about a risk that has occurred, it's obviously accept. We called it a risk because you pre-identified it. If you didn't pre-identify it, it would not be a risk. See? Now, talking about unknown events, the remedy for unknown events is something known as a workaround. But again, we don't use the term unknown risks, at least not anymore. I hope this helps free your mind. You know, you can think of so many scenarios, and you know, you could say a risk has occurred and you decide to do X, or your fallback plan is Y. It's still accept. So you need to be careful with accept. Here's another example. You foresee that a risk could occur, so you send out a team member to gather data. Okay, to gather data, full stop. If it's full stop, you really do not know what that is. Gather data. Are you going to use the data before the risk occurs? Then it could be one of the avoid, transfer, mitigate, escalate. Could be one of those. But the moment you're dealing with it after the fact, if the data is to deal with it after the fact, you are in accept territory. That is a major thing I wanted to let you know today, because I see lots of you struggling with this perspective. A risk has occurred. You do this. It's a contingency. The moment you hear contingency, you know it's an accept clause. The moment you hear fallback plan, you know it's an accept clause. Okay? Someone argues, okay, well, what if I mitigate and then that fails and then I decide to do something else like a fallback plan? You still mitigate it. It doesn't change the fact that your initial response was mitigate. Now you can have cascading responses, but your initial response is mitigate. All right? So let's keep it simple. Anything you do after the risk has happened, you accepted it. Anything you do before, you took proactive steps. All right? Besides putting money aside, if you took proactive steps, then it's one of those other ones. It's either the A for avoid, the transfer, the mitigate, the escalate, not the accept. The mnemonic for the negative risks is A-team. A for accept, T for transfer, E for escalate, A for avoid, and M for mitigate. I hope this helps you. I deliberately made this to help you better understand the dynamics, okay? I'll speak to you guys soon. Take care. Bye.